Imagine stepping into the most dazzling palace on earth, a masterpiece of gold and glass, only to be hit by a stench so foul it makes you physically gag. Welcome to Versailles in the 1600s, where ultimate luxury masked an unimaginable nightmare of filth. Let's paint a picture of the Sun King's magnificent court. When you envision the Palace of Versailles during the reign of Louis XIV, you likely picture sprawling manicured gardens, the breathtaking hall of mirrors and courtiers draped in pristine silks, lace, and velvet. It was the absolute epicenter of European wealth, power, and high fashion. But beneath this breathtaking facade of extreme opulence lay a highly pungent, incredibly unhygienic reality that modern historians often describe as a beautiful, gilded cesspool. To truly understand the daily life at Versailles, you have to realize that this monumental architectural achievement was entirely devoid of any modern plumbing or comprehensive sewage system. Yet, it housed a staggering population. At its peak, the palace and its immediate outbuildings were crammed with up to 10,000 residents, including aristocrats, visiting dignitaries, military officials, and a massive army of servants. Now, imagine putting 10,000 people into a single enclosed structure without flushing toilets. The result was an environmental and sanitary catastrophe. While the highest-ranking nobles might have had the luxury of a personal chamber pot or a padded commode stool kept in a small closet, there was nowhere for that waste to magically disappear. Servants were tasked with emptying these pots, and more often than not, the contents were haphazardly tossed directly out of the palace windows, splashing into the courtyards or gardens below. But for the thousands of other daily visitors and lesser courtiers who lacked private quarters, the situation was far more desperate and much more public. When nature called, people simply did not have the time or the facilities to seek out a designated area. Consequently, the pristine corners, hidden alcoves, grand staircases, and echoing corridors of Versailles were frequently utilized as makeshift latrines. It was remarkably common for a finely dressed nobleman or noblewoman to simply step behind a curtain, lift their heavy embroidered skirts, or drop their breeches to relieve themselves right there on the floor. Now, contemporary accounts from horrified visitors reported that the smell of ammonia, decaying matter, and human waste was practically suffocating, seeping into the very stone and woodwork of the palace. The intense summer heat only amplified this horrific stench, baking the urine and feces that coated the walkways. We must end. You could be admiring a priceless tapestry or a masterpiece of Renaissance painting only to realize you were standing inches away from a pile of fresh human excrement. This was a world where a courtier's glittering jewel-encrusted heels were just as likely to step in human filth as they were to glide across a polished ballroom floor. The sheer scale of the palace made thorough cleaning practically impossible, meaning the odor of rot and waste became a permanent fixture of royal life, deeply embedded into the fabric of the building itself. Even the king himself was entirely accustomed to the foul air, viewing it as a completely normal, expected aspect of daily existence. The glamorous illusion of absolute perfection was quite literally built upon a severely sickening foundation window. If the palace itself was a giant gilded toilet, you might assume that the aristocrats at least kept their own bodies sparkling clean to compensate. The reality, however, was quite the opposite, driven by a bizarre and deeply ingrained medical paranoia. In the 17th century, the prevailing scientific and medical belief was that water, especially hot water, was incredibly dangerous. Leading doctors advised that submerging the body in a hot bath would cause the skin's pores to open wide, essentially rolling out the red carpet for deadly diseases like the plague and syphilis to invade the internal organs. Because of this terrifying misconception, full-body bathing was not just rare, it was actively avoided and viewed as a perilous health hazard. The body, even the Sun King himself, who dictated every facet of European fashion and etiquette, is reported to have taken only a handful of baths, music, during his entire lengthy life, and only then, under extreme medical duress. Instead of washing, with water. The wealthy elites practiced what they considered dry washing hydrotherapy. They firmly believed that vigorously rubbing the skin with dry white linen cloths would safely absorb and wick away all the sweat, dirt, and impurities. A courtier's wealth and cleanliness were therefore judged not by how often they washed their skin, but by how many times a day they changed their expensive linen shirts, monogrammed. Consequently, beneath layers of expensive bride and velvet, these people harbored months or even years of accumulated sweat, dead skin cells, and intense body odor. To mask the inevitably staggering human stench of thousands of unwashed bodies crammed into the unventilated palace, the residents of Versailles turned to aggressive, overpowering fragrances. Both men and women drenched themselves, their clothing, their gloves, and even their furniture in thick animaler perfumes made from ambergris, musk, and civet. These heavy, musky scents didn't neutralize the body odor. They simply mixed with it, creating a thick, cloying, sweet, and sour miasma that hung heavily in the air and regularly caused visitors to suffer from debilitating migraines. But the horror didn't stop at body odor. The era's iconic fashion statement, the towering, elaborate powdered wig or peruke, was a completely different kind of nightmare. Originally popularized to hide hair loss caused by widespread outbreaks of disease, these massive hair pieces quickly became mandatory court attire, made from horsehair, goat hair, or the hair of peasants. These wigs were practically never washed. Instead, they were heavily pomaded with animal fats and thickly coated in scented flour or starch, creating the absolute perfect cozy breeding ground for head lice, ticks, and fleas. The infestations were so incredibly severe and universally common that specialized long-handled head-scratching sticks were fashioned from silver and ivory. Courtiers used these tools to frantically dig at the itchy pests crawling around their scalps, without ruining their elaborate hairstyles. In public, periodically, these vermin-infested wigs had to be sent to wig makers to be literally baked in hot ovens just to kill off the swarms of lice and nits living inside the artificial hair. So, when you picture the elegant dances and whispered courtly romances, you must also picture the relentless, maddening scratching, the overwhelming cloud of musk mixed with stale sweat, and the constant, inescapable feeling of being incredibly hopelessly unclean. The inevitable consequence of living in a crowded, feces-ridden palace with a total aversion to water was a devastating and constant cycle of disease. While the courtiers of Versailles obsessed over political power and social hierarchy, they were ultimately powerless against the microscopic enemies thriving in their own hallways. Dysentery, typhoid, smallpox, and measles ripped through the royal court with terrifying regularity. Even the royal family was not spared. Louis XIV lost several children and grandchildren to diseases that thrived in these horrifyingly unsanitary conditions. Sighs. When a noble inevitably fell ill, the medical treatments of the 17th century were often far more torturous and sometimes more lethal than the diseases themselves. The era's physicians relied heavily on the ancient theory of bodily humors, believing that illness was caused by an internal imbalance. To cure their wealthy patients, doctors prescribed relentless regimens of bloodletting, draining pints of blood, using sharp lancets and leeches, severely weakening an already compromised immune system. Imagine the scene. A wealthy aristocrat lying in a magnificent silk, draped 4 poster beds surrounded by priceless art, while a physician actively bleeds them into a silver bowl. If bleeding didn't work, they turned to violent purgatives and enemas, forcing the patient to brutally expel fluids in a misguided attempt to flush out the sickness. The king's own chief physician was infamous for prescribing these brutal treatments, essentially torturing royal patients in the name of cutting-edge science. Dental hygiene was another profound horror show. Sugar, a wildly expensive luxury, was consumed in massive quantities by the elite, leading to rampant, agonizing tooth decay. With no real dentistry, rotting teeth were simply yanked out without any anesthesia. frequently causing massive facial infections. Louis XIV himself had a portion of his upper jaw broken during a botched tooth extraction, leaving a permanent hole in his palate that caused wine to shoot out of his nose when he drank a gross indignity for the absolute monarch of France, which his doctors fixed by cauterizing the open wound with red-hot iron. And yet, despite the rotting teeth, the lice-infested wigs, the suffocating stench of human excrement, and the constant shadow of a brutal, agonizing death, the elaborate theater of Versailles never stopped playing. Courtiers continued to thickly powder their pockmarked faces, drench their unwashed bodies in heavy civet musk, music, and strut down the feces-stained corridors as if they were walking on air. The Palace of Versailles remains an undeniable music, architectural marvel, and a testament to human artistry. But looking past the gold, Leaf reveals a profound historical irony. The absolute pinnacle of 17th century civilization, the most envied court in the entire world, was at its core a magnificent facade hiding a squalid, pestilence-filled reality. The next time you watch a sweeping historical drama featuring flawless complexions and pristine gowns, remember the hidden truth. True luxury isn't a crown or a palace. It's a flushing toilet and a hot shower. Additional important information. Some accounts note that Versailles did have commodes and heavily used latrines in corridors and stairwells, but they were far too few for the thousands present. The smell became so notorious that a rule was put in place to cleanse hallways regularly, and orange trees were brought indoors in vases to help mask odors. And stories circulated of waste being thrown into inner courtyards and nearly striking high-ranking visitors, while the only actual fixed toilets were limited to the very top of the royal household, and came much later than most people assume. And with wigs, one practical reason they lasted so long was that delousing a wig could be outsourced to a wig maker who could boil the hairpiece and remove nits. And the famous dental disaster of Louis XIV is described as a dramatic moment that helped underline how even kings could not escape the era's brutal mouth care and surgery without anesthesia.